In this video, I am going to cover the Colonial Born game design document so that we can get sort of an aspirational view of what it is that I'm trying to create the next year, and also give you a sense of what's going to make Colonial Born different than your traditional tabletop role-playing game. Now, a game design document is used typically to have all things like player feedback loops, what the game's primary goals are, the feeling it wants to create. I'm not going to go into that kind of depth with this game design document because in my mind, you already know how a tabletop role-playing game works, and I'm not innovating enough on the narrative side for that to really change. So what this is going to be about is primarily what makes Colonial Born as opposed to another tabletop role-playing game, which may have different feel when you're sitting around the table. So Colonial Born is a space fantasy tabletop role-playing game that takes players into the far reaches of space, where we explore, we exploit, and the goal would be for the author, being the player, to experience the most complete and unique cinematic experience in the theater of the mind. When I first made Spectre version 1, one of the key things that I wanted that I wasn't getting out of my other role-playing game experiences was a really, truly immersive cinematic experience. I wanted to manufacture those moments. I wanted to be the author of those moments. And I didn't feel like I was really getting the chance to do that. I felt like, yes, there were some fun moments that happened, but I didn't really feel like I was authoring them. And they never really felt truly big and cinematic in the way that I wanted them to. Ultimately, of course, because I went into animation and became a creative director, I began to see some of the pitfalls of what my goals were. But also in the process of making this game, I've learned better what's going wrong and where Colonial Born has something to contribute that other games maybe don't. So there are 3 ways that we're going to achieve this feel. The first is I want players to create truly unique characters. And I'm not just talking about in personality, but I'm also talking about play style. So I want to make it possible for a player to express themselves through their character in as many ways as possible so that that character feels completely and totally authored by them. Second is I want to offer up truly cinematic experiences. Which goes back to the actual feel of the game and how a session plays out. And there are very few ways to do this under the current approach. But I think I have a few ways that I can innovate on the existing model to change that, to make it more cinematic. And the third would be to make it fairly easy to learn without necessarily sacrificing the complexity of a really deep tabletop game. Or a role-playing game specifically. So how are we going to do this? What am I going to introduce? So first, we're going to cover truly unique characters and playstyles. So the first part of this process is what I call the Essence Experience dual currency system. So in a traditional role-playing game, you earn experience, and at certain points, you have this magical threshold where you gain power and health and energy and all this other stuff. I don't want to do that. And I don't want to do that because I think it deprives the game of a degree of flexibility that it needs. And it also makes progression a fairly linear process. Instead, I'd like feedbacks inside the mechanics that ultimately mean that decisions don't necessarily play out the same way for every player. And I think the best way to do that is to create a dual currency system. And I'll explain what I mean. So essence is representative of a character's overall physical condition. So species will have a set amount of essence when they're born, and they spend it as they age and deteriorate. Training new actions cause characters to lose essence and advance into different stages of their lifespan. So the best way to think about essence is to think of it like the number of days you have in your life, right? As you age, you have physical things that change, your hit dice, your stamina, that kind of thing. But also your ability to apply knowledge and your ability to make connections that you couldn't in youth. These are things that become advantages later in life. And so each stage of your lifespan, adolescence, adulthood, maturity, seniority, each of these stages has its own kind of characteristic feel. And so with essence, you have an opportunity to pass through these different stages of your lifespan. So it starts with a finite amount. Every species will have a different finite amount and different stages. And every species will progress through them at different rates. But what essence is depleted by, which is the key kind of question as to how this all works, is primarily by actions which take time. So think of it like training in new powers or the forging of weapons and armor. When you're training or forging, you're taking up a tremendous amount of time in order to embed a skill into your memory. And so in this way, essence is consumed and not experienced. You're not learning something new. You're not acquiring a new skill. You are spending time to improve it. And so that's primarily the way that essence is going to be consumed. Secondary to that, there will be actions of certain types that deplete one's essence. A great example of this is regeneration. Because this is a sci-fi game, I'm dialing down on this idea that we only have a finite number of cells in our body. And so regeneration isn't infinite. It costs some amount of essence. You have to borrow a certain amount of essence to take a regeneration action. Likewise, there's things like exertion, where one pushes oneself well past their limits. You've heard many times people saying, in that single year, I think I aged more than I have in 5. And it's because they're working so freaking hard on a project or on a new job or something like that, that they just burn away all that essence, that life that they have. And it causes them to prematurely age. That's where actions can consume essence. Stimulants, drugs, they have practical game effects. They have augmentations. They improve you, but they cost essence. They deplete what you are, and they cut off your lifespan. And then there's some powers like consumption, which is a vampiric action. And yes, it consumes your health. Yes, it consumes your energy, but it also steals from your lifespan. And so the idea that characters can prematurely age creates this unique opportunity that doesn't exist in other systems, where the player can make a decision. I am going to exert myself. Yes, I'm old, but I am going to exert myself well past my limits to kill this boss, even if it costs me my own life. And so there's that incredibly cinematic moment, which is going back to number 2. But it's this incredible cinematic moment where you say, the party's in trouble. Now I need to burn hot and bright, but for a very short period of time, in order to save everyone's lives at the cost of my own. Every role player wants to have that moment where they're Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Essence makes that possible. Then separately, there's another currency system, which is experience, which I've kind of already touched on. And it's representative of a character's learning. The ability to spend experience to obtain new skills, abilities, powers, that kind of thing. So it's basically experience is used for the acquisition of new skills and essence for the training in making those skills better. And so then it goes back to character progression. The next stage is character progression. And I mentioned I don't want this threshold, the level up threshold, where suddenly things change. Instead, what I want to do is I want to introduce this idea of intentionality. So in the game, there are 9 intentions: preservation, annihilation, authority, change, enforcement, purity, craving, and invention. I skipped over one. But what the intentions are is what a character means to do in their lives, how they want to fulfill themselves, what they want to create, or what kind of impact they want to have on the world. And I got wrapped up in this idea where if you were a doctor, and your intention was preservation, then when you get caught in the back alley, like Thomas Wayne, and you're being held up with your wife and young Batman son, that you have to fight a robber, and inevitably you have to subdue them. Or you can't preserve your family. But what if you killed the mugger, the robber? Would you learn from that? What kind of experience would you get? And my argument was that a character who has preservation as an intention would simply accrue trauma. They wouldn't learn how to kill a person better. They would just kill a person and not really learn from it. Whereas a person with the annihilation intent would seek to destroy others. And so a person with preservation will not learn, they will not gain experience by taking an action what is out of character. A character with annihilation won't learn by healing people. And so actions will have intentions as well. And when a character takes an action which aligns with their intention, they gain experience. And then players have an incentive to play to type. So rather than have this problem, which is so common in tabletop role-playing games, of players eventually all playing the same character, you have a mechanical way to guide people back to the intended, to a divergent character stream. So yes, I play all my characters to be gloaty and boisterous and talking people down and being diplomatic. But if this is an authority intention, then I'm not going to gain a lot of experience by trying to find my way out of a fight. But I will gain an awful lot of experience if I take the annihilation track and kill them. So just because I like to talk my way out of problems doesn't necessarily mean it's right for my character. And now I've got an actual incentive. Way to that I can only earn experience by killing. Now I have to play to type. And so I saw this as a way where an early decision enables a player to decide how they can create or manufacture that moment that they've never manufactured before, which again comes back to cinema. So then there's the idea of derivative stats. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce unique derivative stats. What's a derivative stat? So you can understand what a derivative stat is in comparison to a base stat. A base stat is your strength and your dexterity or whatever. In my game, there's vitality, physique, fortitude, ingenuity, perception, and spirit. And so a player has these base stats, and then they have derivative stats like health or proficiencies or things like that. And what I wanted to do was make every species derive stats differently than another. So an example would be for humans whose health is based on vitality, and Molochans whose health is based on spirit. So if health is derived from a different stat, then when a person comes up with a power like bioelectricity, which is also derived from spirit. They earn bioelectricity. They earn it with experience. They pay for it, and then they go and they try and use it. That a human using bioelectricity is going to have a very different mechanical representation than a Molokan using bioelectricity, because the Molokan is going to have bioelectricity and they're going to have a big boon to their health. So it's a really good idea for him to pick bioelectricity because it amplifies what's already good against the character, right? That character with bioelectricity that's a Molokan is a really good draw aggro character. But bioelectric character that's human, humans don't have a lot of spirit. They're big in faculty and ingenuity. And so they're invested in things which produce really good outcomes for things like forging and stuff like that. But if they pick bioelectricity, then you have a very different character because their health isn't boosted way up. So they're going to use bioelectricity differently than the Molokan would. And then this comes back to yet another idea, which is that I want the game to not necessarily end when a play session ends. So this is a kind of a more theoretical game design kind of exercise for me. So what I noticed was that a lot of players, when they played my game, would go home and they would roll up characters they would never play. And I think this comes from an impulse to keep playing between sessions. So when the session ends, the player doesn't want it to end. And so when they go and they have to wait for like a week or however long, they feel like they want to still inhabit this world. They still want to do things with their character, but they can't because their character's locked in. It has to be the same character when they come back around for the next session. I felt like collectible card games kind of addressed this problem. So I play Magic the Gathering, and what I noticed is the exact same behavior is in play. I love my decks. I love what they can do. I love showing people what they can do. I love seeing how all those interactions happen on the table. And then when the game is over, I go home and I build more decks. The thing is this process is fruitful for a collectible card game. It's not fruitful for a tabletop role-playing game. And so I thought, what would be interesting is if there was a means by which players could still work on their characters between sessions in a way that doesn't destabilize the narrative that's in play. And that led to this idea of creating your own actions. So in a traditional tabletop role-playing game, there is very specific kind of branches. So first you pick your race, then you pick your class, then you pick what class specialty you're going to have. Then you pick a bunch of magics from a very narrow set of magics that you have. And effectively, that is how the whole game is played. Every character is a magic user because all actions are a form of magic. And the only real decisions that you have in your progression is how you fork differently than you could have forked. So I think in D&D 5e, there's 3 points where a character forks in their specialization. And at every single level in which there's 30, the options for spells widen. But essentially, you're still leaning on 356 magic spells that comprise effectively the whole game. And I didn't like this for Colonial Born. What I thought would be really interesting instead was the idea that players could invoke, create, manufacture their own spells. That they could essentially create their own magic on the fly. And this idea, which started out as a very simple one, proved to be incredibly difficult for me to execute on. So eventually I arrived at this idea of deck building as a solution to that. So I created training cards. So training cards are component cards that can be put together to craft character actions. And players can use these cards to create their own signature magic, martial arts, other moves, other actions, including speech actions, control actions, all sorts of different things. And then they can train these actions at a cost of essence. So there's two options for the player. Either they can improvise with the cards, which is incredibly risky because it's going to carry real consequences in the form of misfortune if you miss. But on the other side, there's a lot of flexibility there. If a character doesn't want to suffer the downsides of improvisation, then they can spend the essence to train the action, which eliminates a lot of the misfortune and really only creates a problem if you critically miss. So in this way, players are able actually to express themselves even through the actions that they're making. The process of making an action is not something that necessarily needs to happen in the game session, because you have only a fixed amount of cards in your hand from one session to the next session. And so the way that you put them together doesn't really change. The way you put them together doesn't really have an impact, I guess is what I should say, from one session to a next, because every player could improvise that action. The only difference is the exploration of how to improvise that action, which is something that can happen between sessions. And so this becomes a way for that character to be further explored after the session ends, and I think it will improve the overall experience of playing the game. But there's one major downside in that terrestrials, humans, don't have the ability to use powers. And so they're inherently constrained by what they can do. And so this brought me right back to the idea of a crafting economy. One of the key things about my universe, one of the key sets about my parts of my setting, is that terrestrial humans went into space because their unique characteristic is they're industrious in their ability to invent. And then they find all these species out there who don't have the same level of industrious or the same impulse to explore, to exploit, to create new technologies, invent and develop. And they don't have this fundamental drive for progress because they have the ability to manipulate their environment in ways that we don't. So the need for them to find free energy doesn't exist if their whole biosphere and biology is oriented around bioelectricity, right? So that impulse is driven by our inability to tie into the ephemeral. But this means that for the setting to properly express itself, I need to be able to create weapons and armor, and I need to be able to craft these things, and I need a whole crafting system that enables the player to express themselves through that. And so the crafting economy will be the third great pillar of the game, because we have our essence system, we have our experience system, and then we have raw materials that have to be extracted from the environment, used, repurposed, turned into weapons, armor, and machinery, and then eventually cybernetics, which can be ways that human players are able to access the ephemeral, the thaumaturgic, the magical. And so these are all the different ways I see that a character can express themselves. It's down to what they wear, down to what they use as weaponry, down to how they the actions that they perform with that armor, with that weaponry, and the character that they've built up around, which expresses themselves differently than a character of a different species. So these are the 5 pillars of what I'm going to do for giving the most optionality for authorship of a character. Which brings me to cinema on the table. So for cinema on the table, I think first we need to discuss what the problem is. So I approached I've worked in software development and for several different tech companies. It's kind of one of those things about being an animator is that you find yourself in weird places. And so when I was in software development, I became very versed in engineering and software engineering and some of the rules of that. And I became convinced that there is 3 interfaces in the tabletop role-playing game. There's the interface of the other players, the interface that is the game board, and the interface that is the character sheet. So when I look through the lens of interface design and looked at the tabletop role-playing game, I began to arrive at a different vision of why cinema works in some games and doesn't in others. So let's look at kind of this dissection, understand where I'm going with it. So the interface of the other players, it's where all the narrative is developed and the plot moves forward. So it's also where character and personality is expressed. When you interact with the other player interface, the story moves forward and you express the personality of your character and you describe what you're doing and you form the greater theater, the stage, if you will, upon which the decisions get made. The interface of the game board is the place that orients us in the game world. It's also where the decisions get made. When you're looking at the game board and you're in a combat scenario, you're looking at that and you're looking for opportunities to exploit the situation at hand. This describes the situation at hand. And so, as a bit of a side note, the introduction of miniatures or the miniaturization of that game board intensifies. It doesn't detract from the theater of the mind. It helps us imagine new possibilities. So I think the traditional way of looking at the game board and through miniaturization is that it takes away what's going on inside your head. I disagree with this because I think when you put all those miniatures on the board, you're creating imaginings that you never would have thought of. If the character is oriented here and there is a window to that side, that has to be described to me unless I can see it on the game board. And so I never would have come up with the idea of kicking them through the window if not for the miniature. And so the idea of this flow that happens, like I think the Imagineering part of it, the theater in the mind, happens anyway. The miniatures and the miniaturization of the game board is simply a feedback mechanism that provides me with more opportunities for more tangible rewards. And I think this is described a little bit by a lot of filmmakers out there. You hear a lot, especially more traditionalist filmmakers, say that when they put a camera in the environment, they see things that they wouldn't have seen when they were working in storyboard. And so a lot of cinephiles will talk about why live action is very different from the animated world, because in animation, everything's manufactured. It's all engineered. The end product is produced. Whereas in the world of live action, you're responding, you're living inside the space, you're seeing the space. The space is feeding back, it's giving you inspiration. And I feel like the tabletop has the opportunity of doing both of these things when it's miniaturized. Finally, there's the interface of the character sheet. So the interface of the character sheet facilitates the game experience through rules and mechanics, and it provides us with the constraints that we can act under. It's also where we process and track the consequences of our in-game decisions. So, seen in this way, we can see that other players and the game board are inherently productive interfaces. They produce things which move the narrative forward, they enhance the theater of the mind, and they provide critical feedback loops. for interaction. But by contrast, the character sheets don't. However necessary a character sheet is, when a player retreats into a character sheet, the pace of combat slows. If the player can't find what they're looking for, then they make the even more glacial decision of going back into the rule book. And this creates all sorts of unintended consequences. People having fights over rules, or nitpicking over the language of a thing, or, simply overlooking things like turn order, or missing something like a proficiency that will modify something, and so therefore an action failed when it shouldn't have. All of these unintended consequences are happening because of the character sheet interface. And that's not to detract and say character sheets bad, because character sheets are necessary to make the game work. It's what facilitates the expression of character. But the problem is, as a human interface, it detracts from cinema. It detracts from the theater. It detracts from the narration moving forward. And so what I am concluding from this is that we need to reduce the number of times we interact with the character sheet interface if you want to enhance the game board and other players and make that a bigger proportionality of your game experience and therefore more cinema. So features of Colonial Born that make this possible. First, I'm going to make digital character sheets. That's not to be confused with virtual tabletops. Digital character sheets have a number of clear advantages, but they don't do what virtual tabletops do. So a virtual tabletop is the character sheet and the game board virtualized. A VTT is primarily providing an advantage of the economics of the tabletop environment, right? What it does is it makes it more accessible to have a more immersive experience on the table. It also virtualizes the sheets. The trouble that I see with the VTT, and not to say that a virtual tabletop isn't something we might explore in the future, but it's certainly not on the roadmap right now, is that we invest a lot of time in VTTs, but we don't necessarily get that lovely feedback of seeing the window. Miniaturization is still in my mind superior than a flat VTT. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a place for VTTs if they go full 3D, if they see things. But when you have that disconnect with the game board, it doesn't help with the theater of the mind. It also doesn't help when it makes it a little less real. So digital character sheets, yes, for the moment. Virtual tabletop, no. So what are the clear advantages for a digital character sheet? Well, one, there's significantly less information retrieval. If stats are derived automatically and the process is happening largely under the hood, then we don't have as many points of failure or as many interface points or interaction points with the character sheet interface. So it's producing a lot of those answers for us. It also means that we spend less time copying things down. So there's less inherent math if a lot of it's happening on the sheet, which is, again, a reduction in the number of interactions with that interface. Number two, it can organize the experience for a GM by tracking things like action pools, handling initiative and turn order, which allows the GM to focus on narrative storytelling, which enhances narrative storytelling. Number three is that it the more work that the digital client is doing, the fewer opportunities there are for role warriors to get into fights and to get caught up in technicalities. So, yes, you can be stickler on rules. Yes, you can be very technical kind of player, but that shouldn't advantage you if you have a good digital character sheet. Finally, it increases the pace of decision making, which moves the narrative forward. So this gives the theater of mind more room to exert itself, and it makes the game more emotionally productive. So if you are making decisions like once every 5 minutes, then it creates a barrier for things like tension to build up, or for excitement to build up. These things are hampered by the pace. And so if you want to increase the tempo of the game so that you get more emotional productivity out of the experience, then increasing the pace of decision making is good. And that's what digital character sheets can do. So by doing digital character sheets, which will be a focus of Colonial Born, we're going to make this possible. Number two, the big number two, is that the money is in the miniatures. So what I don't want is for all of my money to be invested in the thing that detracts from the player experience, which is what happens when we spend $60 on a rule book. If I've only got $60 to spend, I don't want it in a rule book. I don't want it in character sheets. I don't want it in paper. Because, as I've mentioned with the interface analysis, it's not the productive place for that money to be spent. Where I want that investment is on the table. I want to see that investment on the table. I want really nice miniatures. I want beautiful terrain. I want exactly what I need to get the feedback going to enhance the theater of the mind part. So for that reason, the game will be print and play. The player's handbook will be print and play. If you want, the cards will be print and play. You can still play the game in analog, although the digital character sheets will also be free. And what I want to do is I want to make the miniatures, the terrain, the cosmetics, and other tabletop accessories the thing you're paying the money for. So if you're only going to spend $60, you're not going to spend it on the player's handbook. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to spend it on miniatures, terrain, and things that enhance the experience. Now, the truth is tabletop miniatures are bloody expensive. You can easily pay $60 for a single mini. If what you want is something high quality. What I have found was when I started my journey into miniaturizing my tabletop, I was spending a lot of money, and I was kind of uncomfortable with having the conversations with my wife about where the money was coming from to be able to add more MDF terrain, to add this, to add that, to whatever. My fix came when I started doing 3D printing, because 3D printing is in spite of the upfront cost of the printer, 3D printing is 1/10 of the price. It's more flexible. I control what I get. I control what I buy. And as a 3D modeler, I can also make Colonial Born related things and print them for the tabletop experience. And so what I've decided to do is I'm going to release 3D printable content, much of which has already been made. And I'm going to release that as things that you can buy, as character options, as skins for characters, as art. So if you want to buy a 3D printable miniature that will represent your character, you will also get the profile image inside the digital character sheet. And so this is the area where, if I'm going to monetize somewhere, I'm not going to feel guilty monetizing there, because this is an investment in time and effort in the ongoing production of the game. I may have to charge for things like campaigns if I can get this thing out there and maintain it. Otherwise, the roadmap for the first year is basically to get out 3 species, with 2 miniatures each, a small campaign with a bunch of monsters and a digital character sheet, and make that module 100% free for everybody who wants to start. So this is the game design that I am endeavoring to create this year. To understand how I'm going to create this, there's going to be a few more videos to come in the background for Colonial Born, which is going to describe things like the setting, the combat system, and the various things that I've been able to do to date, and how that's going to develop. And you're going to start to begin to understand what Colonial Born is and what it can be. So I'm basically at this point diving in, and we'll see where it goes.